posters, we'll start with that. All of the laminated set of posters that you bought in 2016 earlier in the year are outdated already, and I'm sorry, but you know, we try to get them all in one easily postable type set, and then all of the different agencies go and change theirs. So just know that Oregon minimum wage has changed. It'll be a new poster, and apparently it's got, I've got those, it's got all the wage rates for the different 3 counties, or the 3 tiers on there. The federal polygraph protection poster changed, so make sure that you post that up, as well as the Fair Labor Standards Act poster.
Is there much of a change on those lots?
The Fair Labor Standards Act poster includes something about domestic workers, I believe, or maybe that was the minimum wage now. I have to look, but it's like 5 words.
Oh,
It has been included to change the poster.
Gotcha.
Any other questions on those? Where do you post your posters? Yeah, so if it's in a shop and the shop is locked during the day, because you don't want anybody just walking in, then that's not going to be a good place to post the posters, right? It needs to be a place where employees can freely walk in anytime when they're working. You know, they can walk in and see the posters.
Now, we have the main set at the office where they hiring, where they collect their paychecks. So does that meet the requirement, we need to put them in the labor camps as well?
If they have if they can regularly visit where the posters are, and there's no problem with it being locked during the day or whatever, you don't need to have a camp poster. There are posters for the camp though. You know, there's a
So
specific poster.
it's something that those sort of people like, but it's not required.
Are you talking about the field sanitation poster?
No, kind of big employment.
Oh, okay. Well, there's a
There's
a bunch of agencies that are on that compilation of posters, and each one of them really is happy about their own poster sort of thing. So generally, when you have the big laminated set up, whichever agency is coming to inspect or do an investigation, they like to see that their poster is up there, and it's a penalty if you don't have the poster up.
Right, so I mean, everything's in that one central spot.
Yeah.
I didn't know if we had, if it
No,
was
as long as your employees can see it, but my standard thing, if you've got this one guy who never gets to go into the regular posting area because he always leaves his home and goes straight to the field, comes straight out of the field, goes straight home, and he never sees it, then he would be under that different posting requirement.
So where do you put that?
Does that make sense?
Where do you put that if that's what he does?
If that's what he does, you're gonna have to figure out where can he see it regularly. Is there something out on the side of the field sanitation? Is there some spot that you can put the posters out there? Okay, does that make sense? Is everybody, every employee is supposed to have equal opportunity to see posters? All right, so changes to the Fair Labor Standards Act. You've heard a lot of rumble in the news about exempt employees and how the minimum pay that they have to receive every year was doubled from, I think it was like $433 at one point, and now it's up to $913. And then I started getting calls from people wanting to know, does this mean that we have to pay overtime in agriculture now because now agriculture doesn't have that exemption? And the answer is no, that's not what that means. That's conflating 2 different rules. Oregon is still exempt from overtime pay. There is none as long as the work is considered agriculture. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But this has to do with your white-collar level employees. This has to do with people who are paid on a salary basis, and they have duties that meet a duties test that the government has established. They are professionals or managers or executives, and they don't do a lot of hand labor. They're pretty much hired to run departments or divisions or to manage programs of significance. Okay, so these aren't your workers. So the rules for the white collar level, what we call exempt employees, those changed. What changed is who fits that definition now. So it doesn't really affect agriculture as much as it affects, I do not know why this is doing this. Sorry about that. Might be voice activated. So what it affects is like the hotel industry, restaurant industries, those who had managers, they could call them hotel managers or restaurant managers, but they were paid very low. But because they were meeting the previous tests to be a manager, they weren't getting overtime pay when they worked over 40 hours a week. So that's been in existence for many, many, many years. So this change where the wage rate increased to $913 a week essentially made it so those kinds of managers now are entitled to overtime unless the hotel or the restaurants or whatever industry boosted up their wage rate high enough to exempt them from being paid overtime. So that's a lot of gobbledygook, but just so you know, it doesn't affect agriculture as far as overtime pay is concerned. But if you do have managers or supervisors that you're calling managers and supervisors and you're paying them an annual salary, they're not on a time record or a time clock, and you want to keep, and their duties meet the duties tests, and if you have questions about that, let me know, and I'll email you those duty tests, because they're very specific. What does affect you is their salary needs to meet this 913 in order to keep that exemption. And the exemption just means they're exempt from having to record their hours.
Roberta, is it true, I heard recently that anyone who isn't a manager should not be on salary?
Salary over the years has gotten confused, right? People think if you're paid salary, that's all it takes to be a manager. And that's not true. We're allowed to pay our workers salary if we want to. We're allowed to pay them hourly if we want to. And we're allowed to pay them piece rate if we want to. The difference is they still need to be paid for every hour that they work, even if they're salary, unless they are an exempt level that meets this duties test. So the problem that we run into in agriculture is if we pay somebody's salary, we haven't based their salary on a number of hours in the work week. We've just sometimes we come up with a number, this sounds like a good salary, we'll pay that to you every month, and then we don't care what hours they work. And that gets us into trouble because we haven't looked to see, has the employee's work week met that number of hours? Maybe he worked more and the salary that he's given isn't meeting that. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So being exempt from paying overtime as an industry still exists. Sometimes farms can lose the exemption from what the practices the employees are doing. Sometimes the employees will be doing work that isn't considered agricultural work, and we're going to talk about that. And so when that happens, then you're subject to overtime. Like if an employee is spreading bark dust around the owner's home. That's not agriculture, that's not producing a crop, that's not taking a crop to market, it's not anything to do with the crop, right? That's landscaping, and landscaping is not agricultural work. So we've got to be careful about the kinds of work that we have our people do, thinking that once they're agricultural employees, they won't ever have to be paid overtime, because that's not true. There are some times when they do. We're going to talk about that. Okay, well, we're going to talk about it right now, okay? This is really bad, but there's two ways that you can use the ag exemption. One is the type of activity that the business does, and the other is the type of activity that the employee does. So, if the business is doing agricultural type work, which has to be tied to a commodity that you are growing or raising or anything that fits, there's a federal definition, actually Oregon has the same definition, of what agriculture is. It has to do with agricultural commodities.
What about the labor housing and things that go along with agriculture?
Those would fit under this secondary definition of agriculture. There's a primary and a secondary, and anything that is incident to or in conjunction with that farming operation. If you had to put a roof on the barn, that would still be agriculture. Putting the roof on the owner's house is not. See the difference. barn is used on the farm to house the tractors, to store the hay, whatever it is, it has something tied to the business. The farm owner's home doesn't have anything that you live in it, even though you're the farmer. Doesn't work that way. So the activities on the farm, when might you lose your farm exemption from being exempt from overtime? Well, let's say you have a retail stand. And in your retail stand, you are selling not only your commodity that you grew, but you are also selling Coca-Cola or bottled water or fancy little pots to put plants in or apple pies from down the street. Did you grow any of those things? No. You bought them and brought them in and you're selling them. So that's how you would lose your exemption from overtime in that work week. The thing that bothers me about this overtime law that Jenny was talking about is because they're tying then how you count the new wage rate for an employee based on a pay period. Did you pick up on that? When everything in law, I shouldn't say that, I'm not a lawyer, but everything has always been based on a work week, a 7-day work week, and each work week stands independent. So if anything, there needs to be comments changing that language out and bringing it back to a work week standard instead of just pay period standard, because that's just ludicrous. I don't like that. So overtime is based on, this doesn't happen to anybody but me, okay? I'm not gonna take it personally, it's really annoying. Yeah.
What if the roof is on a rental that the farm owns? The farm can't get rid of it because it's part of farm property, but it's rental.
My position, and I'll ask David on his, but mine is that's not agriculture. That is an incident to the farming production.
Right.
Unless you have an employee living in it, it's filed to be there.
It's still not a
It's still
farming tax. It doesn't house implements, equipment, it's, but I don't know how they would interpret, that's how I would.
That's how I would interpret it. Generally, I mean, you may develop other facts, this is farm labor housing that we've got, and maybe if I've got to put a new roof on that, then that's going to be incident too. But generally speaking, just because I got a rental on the house, and one of my employees just happens to be a renter there, isn't going to be enough.
So, sorry, I'm continuing down the same line. If it's an administrative building, if your office is in that building,
That would be farming.
that would be pertinent towards farming? Okay.
And the reason, because that is necessary for you to get your commodity out of the farm and onto the market, because you have to have all the paperwork, you have to have all of the processes,
Your employees,
right?
your office.
It's weird.
But isn't it necessary for you to have your warehouse manager live at your warehouse?
No.
What about custom work for another farm?
Yeah, custom work, it depends on what it is. Custom work has been exempt under MISPA, custom hay harvesting and that sort of thing.
You said for another farm?
Yeah.
Yes.
No. So when we're talking about the ag exemption, we're talking about commodities that you produce, not commodities that anybody else has produced. And you'll see this in hops, you'll see this with nursery, you'll see this in a lot of different areas of ag. When I'm bringing in somebody else's commodities, or I go work on somebody else's farm, it's not your stuff anymore. Right? When it's not my stuff, I don't get the ag exemption. I get the ag exemption for my stuff, not anybody else's. Does that make sense?
But if you become a living contractor,
If you go work on somebody else's farm, then you might need to become a farm labor contractor too, and they may need to be licensed worker leasing company, but there's a separate issue. And so one of the issues is always, whose ground is it? I don't own the ground, but I lease the ground. If I'm just leasing the ground, then it's still my product. That's fine. There's no problem with that. You don't need to own the ground, but it's got to be your product that you're growing.
So if you're plowing for someone else, that would be overtime.
If you're plowing for somebody else that's on their farm, that's their product that you are now paying overtime for your employees to do that. And you may be a farm labor contractor because you now provide contract labor to another farm.
If money changes.
If money changes hands, and even if money doesn't change hands,
No. No, I'm just kidding.
even if money doesn't change hands, some agencies have taken the position that even though money's not changing hands, you're trading commodity, because that's what happens all the time with a neighbor, right? You come over here and I'll do this for you, and then you do this for me, and we're just gonna kind of trade labor a little bit. You're still actually trading labor, which is the value of money, which means it's just a lot harder to catch once the money doesn't trade hands, right?
Sorry, Luke.
Oh, okay. So what if they're split and they're doing some custom work and they're doing some other stuff on the farm? And it's the first hour, but they still work 60 hours. So do you have to pay for that first hour and overtime?
They call it tainting the work week. It's sort of a contamination effect. So if they're 100% agriculture in a week, then there's no overtime. If there's a blend of even a small amount, then that makes it taint the whole work week. There is a provision that is called de minimis, that if it's so small and it happens almost never, it's so rare, the federal U.S. Department of Labor will look over it. They won't care. But that doesn't mean an attorney will look over it. But if it's a regular pattern or if it's a frequency that happens in a year, then you're safest to keep paying overtime. Because you don't want the IRS to get involved either, because there's back taxes and all that hadn't been paid when it should have been paid, and it could grow into a messy problem.
So silly question, similar maybe.
No.
Work 60 hours in a week, 2 hours are non-agriculture related. Do I owe overtime on 20 hours or 2 hours?
20.
Okay.
Anything that goes over 40, anytime, whether we cross that contamination line at the beginning of the week or whether we cross it at the end, it doesn't matter. It's in that 7-day window. That's why it's really important for you to know when does your work week start and when does it stop. Once you know what your work week is, then look at the hours that happened and the work that was done in that 7-day period, and you will know if there was any amount of commingling of crops, or not crops, but commingling of work, a blend or a contamination, whatever the word is, you know that work week you need to have overtime pay for those employees, that only those employees that handled or did that other crop, not the whole workforce, just those employees in question and just for that work week. Does that make sense? So don't go paying everybody the overtime. That sort of work will also fall into the office area. So if let's say you've got a grass seed cleaner and you are cleaning somebody else's, in this work week you're cleaning somebody else's seed at the same time that you're cleaning your own. So you've contaminated the week. So you've got 3 employees that worked in the grass seed cleaner and they are now subject to overtime because they put in 50 hours, let's just say. So those 3 employees get those 10-hour each overtime. But the people in the office that handle the paperwork for that other grass seed grower that you brought in to clean their seed, you have to watch that paper trail, because if they're handling the paper for this other commodity that you didn't grow, they're subject to overtime as well. So watch their hours. If they don't go over 40, no issue.
And remember, if you're not tracking when you're working on your own product and you're working on their product, Department of Labor is going to take the position that maybe the entire time that you could have been housing their product is subject to overtime for all workers, because now we can't even track who was working on it and who wasn't. So now everybody is subject to overtime for a really long time, so long as you were processing, right? So that's something else to keep in mind. I've got, basically, if you're gonna process somebody else's goods, I don't care if you're a grass seed farmer, I don't care if you're hops, I don't care if you're a nursery. As soon as you bring somebody else's product in, you gotta treat it like tainted goods, right? As soon as anybody touches that, we need to note that so that they can get overtime, or you need to at least recognize that fact that I'm not gonna track it, I'm not gonna roll the dice on it. Because I will say, we don't see a lot of litigation on this yet. I think the Oregon Law Center and a couple other places that kind of focus on agriculture workers, they haven't caught on to this issue, but once they do, I think it's going to be a huge explosion, because it's a wage and hour issue. Wage and hour issues, not only are they not insured by just about any one of your insurance policies, sorry, but it comes with penalties, interest, and attorney fees. I've literally had claims where 3 employees were said that they were owed a couple $100. We had to admit 50 cents a piece. Each employee was paid $2,500. And 50 cents of wages because of the penalties, interest, and attorney fees. So imagine all that multiplied by how many workers do you have? And you can get class action claims out of it too. So it can be really dangerous. You thought I was done giving you bad news.
Sit down. Okay, we beat this one to a pulp, so I think we'll see all that. Okay, so, yes?
I have a quick question. So if you have a salaried person in the office and there's a chance there's overtime, do you need to divide their hours and make sure they're making time and a half or minimum wage?
Okay, so the salaried person I'm saying is not exempt, right? It's somebody that would normally be subject to overtime. Not a manager, not a executive.
Someone in the office under I mean, the salary most likely is well above minimum wage, but if you divide it by the hours they work and it's right up to they to be made sure they're paid time and a half all year, or is it just minimum wage to meet that salary requirement?
Okay, so are we trying to find out what their hourly rate would be in order to pay them overtime because they might have done work in that 1 week?
I can just ask you afterwards, I don't want to make this over.
It's okay. So what you will need to do is find out what their hourly rate comes out to in a work week. And then when they do cross over that 40 hours, then you will pay them time and a half. Just for those hours that they crossed over. But I'm happy to talk to you.
Yeah, no, that works. Thanks.
Okay, so are you growing the commodities that you're handling, or are you buying them in and then selling them? Are you buying them in and growing them on for a substantial period of time, or are you turning it around really short? So those kinds of things are the questions. Those kinds of questions are what you need to find out to determine whether or not you're subject to overtime. If you're buying it in really quickly and you're turning it around and selling it, that's an overtime type thing. If you're buying it in, growing it on, and it looks substantially different, that's your own commodity at that point. Okay. All right. Moving on to the work protection standard, because this is changing. It's in process right now in Oregon. This is a federal EPA rule. All of you know what the worker protection standard is when employees handle pesticides or when they work in an area that has been treated with pesticides. They are to receive specific training on how to protect themselves from that kind of exposure, and also the training for handling and that sort of thing. This is under a lot of revision. The biggest things that I want you to understand, the rules aren't done yet, so there's probably going to be more changes, but for right now, there's no grace period on the training. There used to be a 5-day grace period from the time that we hired an employee to the time they could go out and work in a treated area. There's no grace period now, so you will need to make sure that that employee receives the training before you allow the employee to work in that treated area. There is the implementation now of this thing called an AEZ, which is an application exclusion zone, and that is a 100-foot perimeter around the application equipment. Nobody can be in that 100-foot perimeter when an application is being performed. So you'll have to monitor that. The training program content has changed. It's been expanded. I think there were 11 or 12 points before, and now there's something like 23. So you will get that information as it goes. The new training content will be available in 2018. For 2017, we will still use the former content, but we will be required to make sure that we have the employee signature and the training date and all that kind of information to show that we comply. Trainer qualifications are also changing. It used to be if you had a licensed applicator, if you were a licensed applicator, you could do the training. That is still true for handlers. Now there are going to be train-the-trainer courses that you will go through. It's changing a little bit also for the handlers. I won't go there, but just know I'll be sending out when the rules are finalized exactly what the qualifications are to be a work protection center trainer. And the posting requirements have increased. We will have more posters. The label will be required to be posted, the SDS sheet will be required to be posted, and the EPA poster that we're used to. I'm not gonna go over sick leave. I think Jenny did a really good job going over that. My biggest thing is the pay period. I just think that that's okay. And David's most recent newsletter, or it wasn't a newsletter, it was actually an email or anything that you sent out about this OSHA post-accident drug testing. That's rulemaking right now. As far as I know, OSHA can decide whether or not they want, Oregon OSHA can decide whether or not they're going to adopt the federal changes or they're going to write their own rules. We're still waiting to see what they're going to do. But basically, we have to be careful just blanketly testing post-accident any employee for drug or alcohol use. If the accident might not have been caused because of anything to do with alcohol, it was just a freak accident, then obviously you don't want to be drug testing or alcohol testing employees for that. We might want to start looking more closely at reasonable suspicion testing rather than just calling it post-accident testing. Did you want to add anything at all?
Yeah, you guys, I mean, the scenarios where you guys can test are still pretty broad. There's a lot of things like a bee sting or repetitive stress injuries where employers are sending their people off to get tested. Well, post-accident testing is a form of reasonable suspicion testing. We're just saying, we don't know whether drugs are involved, and so just go get tested. So OSHA said that seems pretty retaliatory, especially for people that are getting bee stings or repetitive stress injuries. There's not really a chance that drugs or alcohol play a role in that, so don't test. And that's what they were really saying. And it makes sense to a degree. So now we just have to know what happened in an accident. If they were the one that gets rear-ended, don't test them. If they were the one that rear-ended somebody else, test them, right? So we just need to know, could drugs or alcohol have been a factor in whatever the accident was? And if they could have been, then we're still allowed to test. There's no problem with that. Okay.
Okay, we have 1 minute. Let's just go over these really quickly, just because I get questions a lot, and we have new FEELDS members too that don't have the benefit of having the history of going to the field seminars every year. So, what do you do when you hire a new employee and that new employee does not provide you with a social security number on a W-4? Do you put that employee to work? No.
Because they didn't put it on our
Right, that's okay. So you have 3 days for an employee to do an I-9 form. That's 3 days for them to come in and present their documentation to you. You absolutely need to employ them, right?
I thought people was one that they couldn't go to work until that was filled out.
Yeah, I've read separate that we don't have that 3-day grace period anymore.
We still have 3 days. We still have 3 days to, but I prefer, and David, I'll let you come in and correct me if this is that necessary. I prefer that we don't put the employee to work, we employ, but as soon as the employee is able to satisfy the W-4 or give me some way of reporting payroll taxes, I don't want that employee to incur wages.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm still employing them, for all intents and purposes, they're gonna start accruing sick leave, day one, that sort of thing, have got all the benefits, but there's just too many times where the employee on the third day doesn't bring the documentation. And then we're stuck trying to figure out how to pay wages on an unknown social security number. So the best way to close that circle is just don't put them to work yet.
On the before event, then you would see the card.
Not on a W-4, but on an I-9, yeah. For the W-4, they just know the number, they can fill it in.
Gotta get the name correct with the social security card, so when they kind of fit it.
If they use this, you can do it for that purpose. You can absolutely ask them so that you make sure that you don't transpose numbers or give the name on for your payroll. But under the law, they don't have to show you it for the. Any other questions on that one?
Even the I-9, they don't have to show social security, they have some other things.
Right, if they have something else that satisfies that, the C column, they don't have to show you a social security card at all. In fact, sometimes their documents on list 1 may be different than the documents they give you on list 2, or on section 2, right? They may do an A-CARS, They may fill out that they're a resident on section 1, but then the documents they provide might be a driver's license and a social security number on section 2, and that's totally legitimate, they can do that. So an employee cannot work 1 day past that employment authorization document.
So
When you're
here's
filling
like,
out the back of an I-9, you have to put the expiration date on it. And you have to worry about that.
From the employment authorization document,
Right.
you mean? Yeah, there's an expiration date on there, and it can be anywhere from a year to 2 years.
No, but the A and registration card.
If a document has an expiration, you need to write it down.
For just a
You don't
resident
have to
alien?
track it.
Like, oh, yeah, absolutely, but that isn't anything to do with your employment with that individual. That's an expiration date between the individual and the government.
So if it's expired, it doesn't matter to
It
us.
has to be current at the time of hire, and then after that, if it expires the next day, we don't care. As long as it's current at the time of hire. Or everything. Every document has to be current at the time of hire. So don't make the mistake of tracking green cards or even stamp cards or driver's licenses. The only time you're gonna wanna track a driver's license is if that employee is a driver for you. And then you're not gonna worry about it for the I-9 purposes, you're gonna worry about it for your insurance. All right, farm labor contractors and your liability. It used to be, back in the day, we hired contractors because that was a way of shifting the liability and getting people that we needed, right? Those days are long gone. So now, when you're using a farm labor contractor, you share an awful lot of liability with that contractor. Hazard communication training. You have to help those employees know what are the hazards on your farm when they come to work for you. Where do they find the SDS sheets? Where do they report an injury or an illness? All of those kinds of things. Sick leave, co-track the sick leave hours. Wage and hour issues. How many hours are they working for you? And are your records matching the contractor's records? And if there's a discrepancy, how do you fix that? So don't have this misunderstanding that they're the contractor's employees and I don't have to touch them. I don't have to do it because that's not the case. Okay, Oregon Employment Department and the H-2A program. Those two aren't friends. So just know that if you're an H-2A grower, you have H-2A workers, you will probably see the Oregon Employment Department at your field and at your farm. Let me know if they show up. I'm doing a very informal survey to see if H-2A employers are being scrutinized more differently than other growers by the employment department. Let me know if you see difference. So not too bad, 7 minutes after. Any questions about anything?